Now, I said before that I would tell you a little bit about the box suppers and the pie suppers and how my grandmother's kitchen made quite an impression upon the neighborhood. But before I can do that, I have to explain a little bit about the community at the time I was growing up. Now, I told you about the Angus schoolhouse that my grandfather got kicked out of as soon as he graduated the sixth grade. But by the time my dad came along, the area had outgrown the Angus schoolhouse. So they had built another schoolhouse, much larger, over at Alto. It served the children in the Gavilan Canyon and Eagle Creek Canyon and Little Creek Canyon, and anyone who lived up on the top of Angus Hill. I think for a while the Angus schoolhouse continued for children who were living in the Bonita Valley. But by the time my dad went to school, they most of the kids had moved over to the big schoolhouse at Alto. Now this schoolhouse was much larger. It was one huge room, about 30 by 30, and in the center of it was an enormous potbelly stove. And along one side were living quarters for the headmaster and his family. That was about 10 foot by 30 foot. I think maybe a bedroom on either end and living room, cooking area, that kind of thing. There was very steep stairs that went out of the living quarters down to the creek because the schoolhouse was built on right on the edge of Eagle Creek. And there was a spring box down there where they could go down the stairs and get water and carry it back up to the living quarters. And even when I was little, I remember there were two two-hole outhouses. I'm sure one was for boys and one was for girls. But the Angus schoolhouse, if it operated for a while longer, it probably operated only until about the 1930s. And then it was closed down, and the schools were by World War II, the schools had been pretty much consolidated, and they were busing children either to Ruidoso or to Capitan to go to school. I know that Dad rode a bus and went to Capitan to high school. So the old schoolhouse became a community center. If there was a preacher who came wandering by who didn't have a parish or something like that, they might have like church services for 4 or 5 Sundays in a row before the preacher moved on. And because the schoolhouse was right next to the Pioneer Cemetery, it became pretty much a community center. People would use the schoolhouse for funerals and a few weddings and things like that. But it was also used for meetings, for community meetings, for things that were going on. It was certainly used Decoration Day and Cleanup Day. Now, today we call Decoration Day Memorial Day, and Cleanup Day is called Labor Day. But when I was growing up, Decoration Day was the day that everyone went through their gardens and took out all of the flowers that were growing. Usually it was irises and lilacs, and we had a big snowball bush, and maybe there were some other flowers that would be in bloom at that time. And so all the flowers were cut and they were put in big buckets of water, and you took potluck dishes, and the whole community, people from Nogal, people from Bonita, people from Eagle Creek and Little Creek, and everybody would go over to the cemetery because it was a community pioneer cemetery. And on Decoration Day, Um, you would take the water and glass jars and fill them with water and decorate all of the graves and put flags out. And then after the graves were all decorated, everybody would go down to the Angus schoolhouse, and they had sawhorses and these big long planks, and they would make this huge long table, probably 25-foot long, under the pine trees. And ladies would bring, often I remember times when white linen tablecloths were put across the planks, and there would be all kinds of food: roast beef, roast pork, roast lamb, fried chicken, all kinds of pasta salads and fruit salads and vegetable salads. And at the very end, there would be probably about 10 foot of desserts. And there was every kind of cake you could imagine. Every lady would make her signature cake, whether it be angel food or devil's food or chocolate or coconut or whatever, and they would be iced and just beautiful. And then there would be all kinds of pies, um, lemon meringue pie or whatever. And then there would be the custards, the hard custards like flan or and soft custards and rice puddings and bread puddings, and sauces to put on all of these things. And you would start, everybody brought their own plate and fork. And Grandpa Ferguson, who was a veteran actually of the Spanish American War, would stay at the schoolhouse and start a fire, build a campfire, and he would make cowboy coffee and sit around, and they would go in. They made benches so that when they had funerals and everything, everybody had a bench to sit on. They'd move the benches out so people would be able to sit around, and they would throw quilts down on the ground. And some quilt, one quilt would have little bitty babies, and another quilt would be for babies who were rolling around and had to be watched. And then there were the toddlers, and younger, older children would watch after the toddlers. But when it came time to eat, everybody would line up and take their plate, and you would go down the line of the table. And when your plate was full, you would stop and eat, and then you'd go back and get it to the place you stopped and continue on down the table. And then after everybody had had a chance to eat, they would take more tablecloths and cover the food, and people would sit around. The older people, the adults, would sit around on the benches, and all the kids would, stretch out on quilts on the ground. Most of us fell asleep and took a nap, and the adults would talk about all the people who had died since last year and tell stories about the older ones who had died and that kind of thing. And then as it began to cool off in the afternoon, everybody would gather up their dishes from the potluck and their dirty dishes that they ate from, and put them in a box and put them in the back of the car or the pickup or whatever, and clean up, put up the benches, put away the planks and the sawhorses, and go home. Now, the same kind of thing happened on cleanup day, which is Labor Day, except that the women set out the food and took care of the little children. The older kids went with the men, and they worked in the cemetery. They cut the tall grass and pulled the weeds and cleaned up the graves and did any work that needed to be done, cleared brush. But there came a time when the cemetery was getting pretty full, and they needed to add more land. But land, even in that time, cost money. So, in order to raise money, in order to buy more land for the cemetery, they, every 2 months for a year, they had a pie supper or a box supper. Now, a box supper isn't really in a box. Usually it's a big basket lined with a tablecloth that's about the size that would cover a card table. And each lady would make a special supper. And it would have a meat and a salad and a vegetable and a dessert. And in the summertime, it also included a big jug of iced tea. And then they would put this in this big basket. And then they would pull the tablecloth up around it and tie it with a bow. And the handle of the basket would be decorated with flowers or ribbons or whatever the person had to do. And in the afternoon, while the men were still out working, the women would take the baskets over to the schoolhouse, and inside they would be set up on a table. Now, the only person who knew whose basket belonged to whom, well, no, I don't even think the auctioneer knew. The ladies knew whose basket was whose, but the men didn't. And so, along about 6 o'clock, maybe 6:30, after everybody had a chance to get home from work or whatever they were doing and get the chores done, whole families would show up. Now, each of these suppers was enough for 4 people. So, and people ate a lot more then because they burned off a lot more calories. But each supper was enough for 4 people because sometimes kids went with their dad and sometimes kids went with their mom. And they didn't stay home. They went too, and they had to be fed as well. But someone would be chosen as an auctioneer, and the auctioneer would stand up and he would hold a basket and he would sniff the basket and he'd say, that smells good. And they would auction off the baskets. And as each man bought a basket, he would go up and pay the auctioneer. And then he would go find a place somewhere in the schoolhouse on one of the benches and he would sit down. When all of the baskets had been auctioned off, then the ladies who had been outside or at the back of the room somewhere else and segregated would come in and they would start looking around to see where their basket was. And they would sit down then with the person who bought their basket and eat dinner with the gentleman that bought their basket. This was a lot of fun when you had courting couples or engaged couples or even newlyweds, because the whole fun of the thing was to keep it a secret so that the young men didn't know whose basket belonged to whom. And they would have to try to guess which basket their favored lady had made. Now, a pie supper worked very much in the same in the same in the same way, except that instead of you having to guess what you were going to get for dessert, whether you were going to get a pudding or a cake or a pie or whatever, you knew that the dessert you were going to get with your dinner was going to be some kind of pie. And so I told you about standing on an apple box and rolling out pie dough. I remember one year when they decided I was old enough to have a basket, and probably I was 7 or 8 years old. And I remember making, I don't know what kind of pie I made. I think it must have been cherry because I think that was one of my favorites. But I was rolling out, by the time I was 7, I could roll out the pie dough. Now, I didn't make the pie dough, my grandmother did. But I rolled out the pie dough and I put the pie together. That's when I know it was a cherry pie because that's the year my grandmother taught me to make a lattice topping for the pie, where you have strips of dough and you interlace them to make it look like the top of the pie has been woven together. I cannot remember what the other food was in the basket, but I know it was probably fried chicken and probably coleslaw and maybe potato salad, and I'm not sure what else was in it, but I'm sure it was a nice big basket. And my grandfather helped me decorate it. I remember it must have been in the wintertime because we went up on the hill, got spruce boughs, and I remember that the handle was a garland of spruce boughs interwoven with red ribbon, and the tablecloth was a red and white checked picnic tablecloth. And when the baskets were taken over, mine was set up there among all of the others. And Granddad knew which one was mine because he'd helped me decorate it, but he kept his mouth very, very closed. And as the baskets were being auctioned off, usually a basket brought anywhere from $5 to $15, which was quite a lot in those days um, for some families to manage. But I remember all of the women and girls who had baskets were sitting at the back of the room and listening. And I remember that my basket went for $10. And I was so excited I couldn't hardly sit still, till all the other baskets were auctioned off. But J.B. Hightower, who was the forest ranger who looked after Monjo Lookout Tower all summer, and whose daughter was a very good friend of mine and a very close friend of the family. And I remember the look on his face when I went over and sat down for him because he started looking around for my grandmother and my mother, thinking one of them had done the basket. And then when he realized that I did the basket, it was my basket, and he began opening it up and setting out the pie and looking at everything that was in it. He got the biggest grin on his face. He said, I don't think the two of us can eat all this food. So are you going to take it home or am I? And I said, you get to take the food home, but I have to bring the basket and the tablecloth home. At any rate, I know that buying more land for the cemetery was one time that we used the box suppers and pie suppers. Putting electricity into the schoolhouse, uh, putting up an electric pole with a meter and putting um, lights in so that you didn't have to use um, coal oil lanterns and stuff like that when you had winter meetings there. And I think that they still used when they got instead of benches, they got a good deal on some old church pews and bought those uh, for the for the church. But it was the whole community who came together, and it was our community meeting place. I think that there were occasions when they had baby showers there, and I know that at least at for one for one baby, I don't remember whose baby it was. They had a quilting where they went over and all of the ladies took pieces of fabric that they had left over, and one of the best ways to use up old clothing that had holes in it and couldn't be worn anymore was to cut it up and make quilt pieces out of it. And I know they made 2 or 3 quilts that day for somebody who was having a baby. Probably they did the same thing for wedding showers and things like that as well. The old schoolhouse is still there. It's still occasionally used for a community center for people having a meeting. But most of the old timers are gone, and I think probably Marshall and I are the only ones that really remember going over there for community meetings. But it is still very frequently used for funerals. I know Daddy's funeral was there, and Granddad's and Honey's. I know that Don Peebles funeral was held there. I don't know how often it's used for that purpose, but it's still used a lot for the old timers for their funerals because that's where they say they want their funeral to be in their will or in their wishes or that kind of stuff. But I believe all of my father's generation is now gone. And so it's up to my generation to use it. I don't know that I will, and I don't know how many of the people in my generation will use it, or if it will just become a curiosity. I know that the upkeep and maintenance is taken care of. The Nazarene Church has volunteered to maintain this little piece of history. So I'm very happy. I'm very happy about that. I do know that Memorial Day families do go over. My cousin Elizabeth and I go over. My great grandparents are buried there, and Aunt Lyda and Uncle Henry, and one of their babies that died young. Honey and Granddad are there. Daddy is there. Daddy's cousin Don is there. And even my nephew JB's son, who died, who only lived for a few days, are all buried there. Not too long ago, Marshall called me and told me that R.L. Hagee had died, and we went to his funeral. And Lemoyne Peters died, and they had his funeral there. But so few in that generation left. You know, they're in their late 80s to late 90s, and there just aren't any more of them left. But the families go over. I saw J.B. Hightower's family a couple of years ago on Memorial Day. I usually go now a little bit before Memorial Day when there aren't so many people, so the parking isn't so hard to come by. But almost every time I go over there, I see someone's family coming and taking care of their graves. I take care of Grandpa Ferguson's grave too because he has no family left, and there are a few other graves that I take care of. Make sure that if they're veterans, they have flags, and make sure that they have fresh flowers every year. Though I no longer use fresh flowers the way we did when I was young. Now I use silk flowers, and then I go over on Labor Day and take up the silk flowers that have weathered through the summer, and a hoe and clean up the weeds and stuff like that, and pick up any flags that have blown in the wind until they're whipped out and no longer serviceable, and I bring those home and uh, and burn them as they should be burned. But every year, it seems that there are less and less people that show up to take care of this pioneer cemetery. I hope that all of the families pick at least one or two people out of the family and train them to go over and do that kind of stuff. I know Christopher goes sometimes with me, and sometimes he just goes over and sits on a bench or under a tree and talks to the ancestors a little bit. So maybe others will do that too. At any rate, so all the kitchens in the community, and especially my grandmother's kitchen, produced a lot of sweets and delicacies and things like that for raising money for the community and for things that the community needed. That's all I have for now. But I want to make a little comment here. It's very hard to tell stories when you're not telling stories to someone who's there with you. So I want to encourage anyone who's listening, if you have questions or if you have comments, contact Christopher and let him know that you want stories about this or that, or you want to learn more about a particular subject. Because if I have somebody who stimulates my mind, stories that I have thought I'd forgotten about might come to the surface, or I might know where your interest lies and what stories bore you and what you'd like to know more about. So feel free to contact Christopher um, and let him know. Okie doke. A little addition to the story about Grandmother's Kitchen. When the house burned down in the late 1980s, it was a total loss. Everything burned except for the root cellar. When they were clearing away the rubble, they found the root cellar. The renters who were living in it at the time didn't even know there was a root cellar there. But the jars were still on the shelves, and the root cellar was in perfect condition. It just didn't have stairs to it or anything to cover it. So they used a backhoe and scooped dirt and just filled it in as is. So 2,000 years from now, maybe when archaeologists are digging it up, they'll find whole jars with pickles and preserves, and who knows what they'll find in that root cellar and what they'll think about it. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye bye.